let me know if something's weird.
All right. Okay. So we're here. Welcome. And BJ, how's it going?
Very good, very good. I've been prepping myself, giving myself a pep talk all day to talk about rotations. One
Yeah.
of the biggest one of the biggest things, especially for younger, newer coaches, something that they struggle with, and it's a common question and problem for newer coaches. So I'm
And
excited to
apparently your dog isn't real, as confused by
yeah,
him as well. So that's
yeah,
always good.
he's helping out right now for
Yeah, I
sure.
think rotations, and I think in the description for this, I said there's no right answers here. It's just let's illustrate how to think about them, especially, in your case, you had a coach. Coach Neil, who was asking about, hey, I'm a beach coach. I'm used to two people. I got six people now. What do I do with that? So we can
Right.
talk a little bit about that. And I did look through your stuff a little bit, and I have some questions too. So I think we'll have some fun with it.
Good.
So
Yeah.
here we go. I'll move you around a little bit here.
I think the first thing I would say is it says this on the title page slide for a reason. A presentation like this is really for coaches. So if you're a player, great job doing your extra homework, looking through rotations like this. It's it's tricky, and if your coach has assigned you to look at a video like this or one of thousands of others, the first thing I would do is I would offer one. Maybe you can send your coach to talk to either Steve or me, or go back to your coach and say, "Hey, coach, this makes a lot more sense if we can see it on the floor and not on the screen." It's super hard to translate, um, for most people. It's really hard to translate from the screen to the court. And I'll give you an example of that. For me, by training, I'm a geologist, and a big part of our jobs is to take huge things like this picture of a mountain range and valley, and uh, put that into something that's more conceptual, like a map. And even as geologists, we study for years to be able to get the idea of putting that, really large and something we can see and hold on to, and put that into something you can hold in your hands. And just being able to do those two things, I walked around in Utah for a summer watching, geologists struggle with how to do that. And it's the same thing for kids like this that are on the court. The court looks like that to them. And then as coaches, and in theory at least, adults, we want to put it into something that looks like this. And that's a really hard conceptual idea. And like we were saying before we got on, that's, I don't know if people do this anymore, but it's why mom and dad argued on the family vacation about the map, because either dad or mom couldn't read the map and the other one is driving, and it's a tough thing to do. And that's why your GPS unit makes so much more sense. It doesn't, I mean, it shows you a map, but really it's telling you turn left now, turn right now. And we don't have that capability in volleyball. So, long story to say, this is really for coaches. If players are watching, you're welcome to watch, and you can probably get something out of this. But these ideas are really best in the hands for coaches, and I would say to coaches, the best way to teach players about rotation, and really what we're talking about is overlap rules. The best way to teach about overlap rules is to put six players, or you can even do it with three and four players, on the court, and move the players around, and then show the other players where the problem spots are. If I move you here, where do we have to move everybody else?
Yeah, I think
That's
there's
the way.
another piece. And the other
Yeah,
piece is, and this is just empirical data. If I look at all the videos I've done, the number one video by far is the basics of rotation, and all it does is move six people around the court in a clockwise rotation, one position to another. And you'd
right.
be amazed at how many people, and I'm assuming pretty beginning players, but it could be all. The commentary and the numbers show that. And maybe it's the algorithm too, but it just don't assume your players even understand when they're starting that they have to rotate, and also they're going to ask you, when do we rotate? And the sooner you
Right.
get the idea of when we get the serve back, then we rotate. When we give the serve up, we don't rotate. Now, that sounds really simple, but until they kind of get that, and to your point, getting it on the court is a better way to do it than, or let's say a different way, because some kids will be able, and some coaches will be able to look at a diagram and get it, and some need the tactile stuff. I agree with you. The ideal way is to put them on the court because they can put it all together. They can visualize it. They can feel it, and you know, um, moving them around and getting them to, in fact, I'll take six players and put them like right next to each other in rotate. Not in a court. When let's say we're getting ready for a match and it's a brand new team and all that, I'll put six players in and say, okay, now if we move this way, are we out of rotation? And I'll put all four of them in one place and two in the other. Well, nope, we're still in rotation. It looks goofy, but we're still in rotation, and that's gets them starting to think about, oh, okay, it's not being in a space on the court; it's relative to one another that matters. And once they start getting that, then they get better at that. I have players all the time go, "No, coach, I'm in rotation." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, you are. Sorry." So,
You know, certainly. And it's not easy. It can be difficult, and it's not something that even experienced coaches um, are perfect at. Uh, to me, think back, I believe I have seen um, a former a former guest that we had on the show, Sue Gazansky, was a teacher for USA Volleyball, and I have gone to her session called Problems in Serve Receive. I bet I've gone to see that at least three, if not four times. And every time I go, I learn something. She has some idea where she is on the court with six players and she'll point to a player and say, "That's your best passer. How do we get that person to the place where most of the serves are going to go?" And she chooses all different players. Sometimes it's, the obvious choice, the libero. Sometimes it's the opposite, uh, the player opposite the setter. Um, Sometimes it's the outside hitter too. And then the manipulation that you can do to get that player into a better part of the court becomes critical. Now we're not gonna in this session we're not talking about all the crazy things that you can do. We're gonna show some of the standards and the maybe the first option beyond the standard of both a 6-2 and 5-1 offense. These will be the very basics, which I think is what most people are after. I think maybe in a future session we can go after something that Sue might teach, highlight a player and say, okay, this is your best player. How do we get him in the middle of the court every single time? But that's
yeah,
not what today is about.
cool.
Um, so the basics. This is half of the court. Obviously, the net top of the screen, and then the attack line. That's generally what we'll be looking at most of the time that we talk today. I think one quick thing we have to go over are the zones of the court, just so that we have common language. So, for most of us in the US, and we'll get a few comments about this, I'm sure, but for most of us in the US, the server, the person in the serving spot, one. And in the US, I think because of the way the lineup card is filled out or used to be filled out, we call zone two the front right. And we call it that because that's the second server. And then it just goes counterclockwise around the court 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Um, the reason I have to say that in when I talk to most international coaches, and by international I mean people that are outside of the United States, most of them have said they label the parts of the court by where the quote unquote setter is in a 5-1 system. 5-1 being one setter system, five players being either hitters or the libero. So they label the court, which makes a lot more sense to me, by the way. The server is still zone one, then zone two is where the setter is during the second service. And zone three is where the setter is during the third service, and fourth, fifth, and sixth. So I don't think it's not going to matter too much for us. But when I talk about court zones, I'm going to reference these court zones, 1 and 4 and 3 and 2, as we normally would, or as I assume are normally done in the United States. I think most of our viewers will be from the US, and so I think these court zones will make more sense. That makes some sense to you, Steve?
Yeah, I think so, and yeah, and I'll apologize to our international, well, let's say our global, non-U.S. folks, since we are U.S. centric. That we'll do our best to try to see things through your eyes, but we won't be perfect at it. So bear with us a little bit. But I think that's helpful to know, and something a new coach might not know, or a coach. You get a coach that joins your group from outside the country. They've come into the area, and all of a sudden you two are talking about zone three, and it's not the same place. Okay, good to know.
We're always safe talking about zones 1 and 4, because no matter what, those two zones are the same.
Yeah, yeah,
It's 2, 3, 5, and 6 where there could be confusion. So I think in general, and I'll just tell a quick story about we used to have a great clinic in the United States, the high performance clinic out at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. We're out there one year, I think it was 2017. Karch was there for, I believe it was either his first or second time as a presenter. So there were a ton of people there because everybody wants to hear him speak. He's such a good speaker and excellent coach. And in one of the very first sessions that he did, he made this point that you and I are making right now. He walked up to a player, obviously a younger player, and I think these were 14 or 15-year-olds. And he said to this player in zone 4, "What do you call your outside attack in this area?" And she said, "Oh, we call it a hut." He said, "Okay, at a hut." And I just thought it was a very small thing that he did, but he illustrated how important it was to get on the same page with language really early. He did that with that young player. He gave her that little bit of autonomy to say, "Yeah, this is what I call it." He said, "All right, that's what we're calling it." And he could have easily been, "Well, I'm the national team expert, and we call it a 41 or a 11 or a go rip whatever." but he did not do that. He let this player be at ease in that situation. So just getting on the same page is important.
And I have to say, I struggle with that a little bit. I tend to get kind of locked in. When I first moved here, you know, we actually didn't use the red, white, blue back row zone kind of stuff, but a lot of places
Yeah,
do. And
yeah,
where I grew up in the Midwest, most of the teams used red, white, and blue from left to right across the back of the gym,
sure.
or back of the court. So in this case, looking at this diagram, OH2 would be red, and M1 would be white, and S would be blue. And here it's the exact opposite. And
Yeah,
the reason they do it that way here, or at least what's been explained to me, is that red is R and it's the right back. So that's why we use red over there. And so it's blue, white, red here across the back. Um, I'm like, okay, fine, but, be
sure.
careful if I yell out red, you might not, I might, since I'm a little bit dyslexic to begin with, I might just get caught up there and not make that switch for you. So, and there's a few things like that. So, yes, I think language is important. And, if you're coaching a bunch of kids who are from similar clubs and the clubs use the same language and your language is different, what's better? The go with the coach's language or the coach adapt? You got one person adapting or 15 people adapting. You might be
Yeah, I
better
think
off.
so. Yeah, yeah, that's the biggest thing is you have to get everybody on the same page, and um, it's the last two teams I've been with. It's been a struggle uh, for me as well. You know, I'm I'm from I'm from the Jim Coleman school. We have, these are the names of the attacks, and I know that our national teams have the same names for these attacks. And the last two places I've been use their own system, and it's a very different set of names. So you really do, as a player, as a coach, you have to study. You have to all get everybody all on the same page, and just like these rotations, it takes some practice. It takes it takes a little practice time to get into the right rotation, to get into something that's not an overlap. It even takes practice to substitute. How do we run a sub? How does the libero go in? It takes a little bit of a practice, and a little bit, even for players that have played for 7, 8, 9 years. Hey, just a reminder, libero, when you go in, it's got to be, in the back zone, not the front zone. I mean, it all takes practice for sure, and particularly the language.
Yeah, and Neil, thanks for the comment. Yeah, I think there's a little bit of feedback going on, and we'll try to deal with that. Part of it might be, my audio going into BJ's mic, and part of it might be bandwidth as well. So um,
Yeah,
bear with it.
every 10 seconds or so, there's a little uh, that comes in. There it was,
Yeah, just
right?
just just like that, just happened. So we'll
All
see
right.
what we can do.
So what I put on the screen here is the very basics of a standard, quote unquote standard 5-1 rotation. The setter is in zone one. There's an opposite player in zone four. That's standard everywhere. The one decision that you have to make, that most people do this way, is that the middle hitter number one, is in is to the setter's left, is in front of the setter, and the outside hitter number one is behind the setter. It makes sense that you have your best middle and your best outside hitter right next to the setter, because in theory, you have when the setter is in the front row, you want one of your, there's always going to be one of your two best hitters uh, is going to be in the front row at the same time as that setter. Um, you could flip this thing, and I did not make the slide, but you could have this the other way, where the middle hitter is following the setter, is in this OH1 position, and then the outside would be here, and you when we get to rotation 3, you'll see why most people do it this way. That doesn't mean the other way is wrong, because if you have a middle hitter that can pass, say you're putting your libero in for somebody other than the middles, then flipping the system so that the middle hitter is following the setter makes some sense, or it could make sense. Every one of these things we show you today, there is a variation of, and there are options based on your own team, and you have to consider that. So this is what rotation 1 would look like. If we're standing in rotation 1, we've already kind of gone over this. One of the To receive serve, and that's what most people call quote unquote rotation. We're we're going to move players around so that we can get our best passers into a position where they can receive serve the most. And you can see I've already switched the middle out for the libero, pretty standard move. And the common thing to do in a situation like this is to just pull the outside hitter back so that we have outside hitter 2, the libero, and outside hitter 1 receiving serve. Where are the overlap problems? Hang on. Previous.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, one of the things that you might want to point out here is, in general, we look for our outside hitters to be very good passers and very good attackers, and that's kind of what a lot of this is based on. So that may not be the case for you, and that would be when you get your pad and paper out, or actually little magnets and a magnetic board are a good way to move them around. There's lots of
Yeah.
different ways to do that. But that's where you start scheming a little bit and going, okay, who are my best passers and how do I get them? So the assumption in this setup is that our outside hitters are good passers. And for those of you who do not know the term bro, more experienced coaches have decided that to get a one syllable thing for the libero, which is 3 cylinders, we'll just call him bro. It's not a brother, it's not a guys team here, although I coach guys, but the bro is the libero.
Right on. So I guess before we get any farther into switching people around, I put these little light blue lines on to show the areas of the court, but it also helps with understanding what overlap means. The way I describe it to young players, uh, with apologies, I believe, to Walt Whitman, um, fences make good neighbors. So when we're discussing overlap, it's important to understand the overlap means players that have a common fence. We have to be good neighbors to them. So the outside hitter 1 has to be a good neighbor to the setter because of this fence. And that's a front to back fence. The outside hitter 1 and the middle 2 have a side to side fence. So when we start the play at the moment of serve, and only at the moment of serve, the outside hitter 1 must be a little bit closer to the right side of the court than the middle 2. The middle 2 has no fence with the setter. So the middle 2 and the setter make no difference. It doesn't matter if they're side to side, left or right, back and forth, stepping on each other, because they do not share that common fence. Uh, they don't have to worry about an overlap problem. So really, the biggest problems on the court are the middles. Anybody who's in the zone that the hero is in right now, in zone 6, or in zone 1, 2, 3, confusing myself now. Those people have three fences. The middle two right now has a fence with the outside hitter one, with the opposite, and with the libero. So the opposite fence, the libero, and the outside hitter one. So this player has three, and this player has three. Everybody else only has, in the case of the setter, only has two fences to worry about.
Yeah, and one of the ways I coach players with it is I say, okay, you can't overlap with the person on your right or your left, or in front or behind you, depending on whether you're front row or back row. So what you need to know is who's on your right and left, and if you're all the way to the left, there's nobody on your left, and who's in front or in back of you. So that's another way to kind of make the point.
Yeah, yeah, whatever. And there are a lot of ways of saying it. Um, I think again, I'll stress that the best way to do this is to stand on the court with six people and to point at the people. Have everybody just point. Maybe it's impolite, but you're going to point at the people that you have overlap issues, and it will immediately become obvious to, in this case, it'd be the libero, that the libero can only point in two places, yet there are three people that she needs to worry about. So the way I would say that is point to two of them and look at the third one, so that you know what you're doing. Um,
Another small point, just for those who aren't familiar with it. So, what constitutes overlap? If you're, let's say you're front to back, so let's take the bro and the M2. The bro simply has to have 1 foot further back than the middle, the M2. And so the overlap is just, and again, this gets into when we look at the next animation, when your setter's back row and your opposite or your outside OH1 here is front row, and they drop back to serve receive. The setter only has to have one of their feet behind the 2 feet of the opposite hitter. Now, just a little minor point, but we see a lot of emphasis on leaving as quickly as you possibly can as a setter. You know, especially when you're beginning, don't get called for leaving early. It's not worth, that little bit of time is just not worth it. So don't get your setter focused on that. Just say, look, as soon as it's served, get to where you need to get, but don't get them thinking about, oh my gosh, I got to leave as fast as I can, because they're going to leave early and you're going to get called, and it's just pointless.
I
They're
would
not
say
going to get,
pass
yeah,
more.
yeah, that would be a better thing to focus on. Exactly.
Yeah, in general, we used to have this idea that passing low was going to catch the other team off guard. Well, the other team is already, they're ready for us. No matter how low we pass the ball, the other team is already in position. So we might as well pass the
Yeah,
ball high.
yeah, but we're not, right?
They're exactly right. Exactly right. So pass the ball high, get yourselves ready, and let the other team see the whole play develop, so that they can see where the fake is, as well as what they all have to deal with. But that's another topic for another day. I think we have that covered. So let's go over these common rotation setups. The first one we've already kind of shown. Outside hitter one, who we assume is a good passer, comes back. The setter has to maintain that front to back relationship. The row one is probably the easiest place to deal with this. The issue comes in that the opposite hitter, who would maybe normally hit on the right side of the court, now has to side out on the left. And the outside hitter one has to side out on the right. But there's a middle in place and two other hitters. This should be a very easy rotation to side out, because both the opposite and the outside hitter one should be trained to hit on both sides of the court as outside hitters. There's one easy alternative is to take the setter, and this, if you have a setter maybe that isn't mobile and what we were talking about earlier, move the setter all the way it to the net with the outside hitter one, especially maybe at younger ages. And then we're just going to slide everybody over and have that opposite hitter come back into the passing rotation. I would assume this is the most common alternate passing situation in rotation one. The place we have to be careful, the place we have to be careful is with the libero and the setter. The setter must still be to the right of the libero, and the setter must still be behind the outside hitter. The other tricky spot, the opposite and the outside hitter too have a fence. So the opposite has to be just a little bit in front of that outside hitter too. But I think that's easily accomplished. It doesn't have to be a whole foot, be a quarter of an inch, a millimeter in front of the outside hitter too. And if the referee is calling you on that overlap situation, they're being awfully picky.
Yeah, and I think as your players become more experienced, you'll say something like to the OH2, "Hey, listen, make sure the opposite's a little in front of you." And your more experienced players, the ones who are getting it faster, you're going to coach them up a little bit to say, "Hey, just take a quick look for this," and it
Right.
usually works well. And if you get called, look, if you're a very beginning team and you're doing this early season, referees will usually let the first instance go and tell you about it. And this is at the middle school or even freshman high school level. You'll see some of that. But if you do a good job of coaching them up so that you don't see the out of rotation much, you'll be referees will give you a little more latitude if they know you're doing a good job early, because early season they spend a lot of time calling people out of rotation. And honestly, one of the reasons I don't referee is I don't see it that well on the fly, and it's just not, you know.
Sure.
R2 is my least favorite job, but that also gives me a little respect for what they do. So those are the
Yeah,
kinds of things you can do.
agreed. And USA volleyball referees and international referees and college referees are encouraged to look to see if there's an advantage gained by having that overlap situation. They're also encouraged to let the coach know, hey coach, you're a little bit out of rotation. Hey coach, your setter is leaving a little bit early. I don't want to be calling you for the setter leaving early, so let's clean that up. And I think coaches across the board, um, even your opponent, would say, yeah, that's a good thing. We don't want to mess up the game by calling a lot of overlap. And we had one this year, um, that we had a referee. It was a high school referee, so not one of the other two organizations, excellent organizations I just spoke about. We had a high school referee that did not understand what we were doing. We had a flipped rotation, and it was weird looking, and he called us 6 or 8 times out of rotation simply because it looked weird. Now, after 30 some years of coaching, I know these rotation rules, and we were very cautious about it. But simply because it looked weird, we had a referee calling it. So you do have to be a little bit careful. And my caution to coaches is, if you're going to do something that's pretty strange, I might just ask the referee before the game to take a look. Like, here's what we're going to do. You're going to see this in rotation three. It's legal, and this is why.
Yeah, that's unbelievably excellent advice. I mean, that is something that if you're doing anything unusual, I I had a friend who they would make it look like the outside hitter was back row in the beginning in their serve receive, and then run a play right to him to get the other team to assume there wasn't a hitter there. And you can do stuff like that, but they would tell the referee ahead of time. By the way, I know I'm front row in this this receive, even though it might look back row to begin with. And they'd have the setter, scooch up in front and drop back just before the serve. Now that's tricky stuff, and you don't want to be doing that with when you're beginning. But again, briefing the ref on what you're trying to do can save you a lot of trouble.
Yep. Yep, that's for sure. And we, on that very same thing on our men's team, we scored uh, dozens of points that way and frustrated the other team. And the ref knew exactly what we're doing simply because we shared it with the referee right
It's kind
beforehand.
of the Bill Belichick approach to volleyball. Know the
Yeah, a little
rules.
bit. A little bit. Yeah. So let's start working through some of these. Here's rotation one, another alternative that you can do, and this will open up some some eyes to possibilities. You can, if your outside hitter one is really your best passer, maybe you want that outside hitter one to be in the middle of the court. When we do a weird movement like that, it's important to understand where the overlap issues are. So, one more time, if we move the Libero over, the setter needs to be on the right of the Libero. If we move the outside hitter one all the way back to here, we have to be careful of the front to back row relationship of the outside hitter one and the setter. We have to be a little bit careful of the outside hitter one. We could easily inch the middle two to her left a little bit. The outside hitter two and outside hitter one have no relationship, so it doesn't matter what those two do. You can see our front row here in red, our back row here in black, and we're in perfectly good order to receive serve this way if we want to do so. So this is rotation two. We've rotated everybody just one spot. Here's the middle one has moved over to the left. The outside hitter one has come to the back row. So in theory, we have our maybe our two best hitters, or our two best hitters in those positions are in the back row. The most common and easiest thing to do in rotation two is to simply take your setter and move her to the front row, and then pull that outside hitter two back. Now, if you're watching and paying close attention, I've already created an overlap. The outside hitter two and the libero have a front to back row relationship. So if they line up on the floor the way I've drawn it here, it's awfully close to being an overlap. So the libero should be maybe just a little bit farther back, or the outside hitter two a little farther up, but they should understand that relationship. The place where a lot of coaches get in trouble in rotation two is the setter gets outside of either the outside hitter one or the libero for some reason. That setter just has to look back and see that she's between these two players. And of course, behind the opposite. Another alternative for rotation two is getting that opposite hitter that may be a great passer. If you have an opposite hitter that's a great passer, you have a luxury that most of us would like to have. Then the setter is in a little bit more precarious position. She simply has to be behind that opposite. But again, you can see our front row in the three red players is intact. Our back row is intact, so there's no overlap issue. And the opposite, who is way out of her normal position, simply has to worry about where that setter is, and we have those two in good position there.
Yeah, and for younger teams, what you're going to see in that situation is if the other team's pretty knowledgeable, they're going to serve right at the setter because
Yeah,
that's the confusion zone. So as you're developing, getting that decision that either the opposite or the outside OH1 are going to take this and setter, you just need to get to your spot is important. But generally speaking, earlier on, your setters are usually pretty skilled with all their skills at this age, at the younger ages. And so they're going to be tempted to take that ball. And so that's just something to work on in this
right.
because that this creates that challenge.
Yep, just get them out of there. Setter's just got to clear the area, and there's plenty of time to get out of the way. Another alternate for rotation two is pulling that opposite all the way over to pass on the right. And you can see, again, I've created an overlap problem. Watch the opposite in relation to the middle two. They share a left to right fence. So if I do this, the middle two really needs to move closer to that sideline than what I've drawn. Right here, this is they're clearly in an overlap situation. So the middle two would need to scooch over just a little bit and be over here. The back row is intact, and this is a tough run for the setter. The setter is in a bad spot. As Steve said, I would be serving at this area of the court, and that setter is going to really have to clear out of there pretty quickly. She needs to be between the libero and the outside hitter one. Though she could move up maybe a little bit farther, she still has to be behind that opposite. So row two is a tricky place to mess around with variations in rotation, but it can be done. And I drew up another possibility in rotation two. Maybe your outside hitter two is in there because she is a good passer. Again, front row is intact, left to right. The back row is intact, left to right. And the only two front to back problems are the setter. That's easily taken care of. You have to watch out for the libero and the outside hitter too, because
Yeah, and
they
you do this one if your OH2 is just really your best passer.
yeah, yeah.
And you're going to
And
put
that
them in the middle of
happens.
the court. And yet it absolutely happens.
It,
So
it
that,
happens because yeah, an outside hitter too. Maybe they're not the biggest, strongest, most powerful hitter, but man, I got somebody who can pass, and I need to get him on the floor.
yeah. Or
You
you're in
know?
a situation where you've been going with the kind of the standard one, and the OH2's been in the left back, and they're beating up on the libero. You're just having, you're going to have times when one of them's struggling. So just to do something different, and force the other team to do something different, this is a good option, and it
Yep.
puts the setter in a good place.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is rotation three. You can see the setter has moved into the third spot, and here's our front row in red. The opposite is over here. Where rotation three is the reason that the setter follows the middle one in the rotation, and here's why. The most common rotation three uh, serve receive pattern is to move the setter all the way to the net with middle one and to pull that outside hitter two back. Now the outside hitter two is ready to run right to zone four and hit whatever it is that you call your zone four attacks. And the setter is in a good position. The opposite hitter is in a good position. Maybe the biggest challenge is that the libero, in theory, is the best passer. Not always, but sometimes, and is kind of hidden to the right side of the court. So that I think we'll deal with that a little bit with some of these options.
Yeah, and if you go back to that one
Oh,
just for a
yeah,
second, the other thing here that you might notice is if you look at where the setter is. Now the setter has a lateral overlap challenge with the OH1, so they can come as far over to the right as just before the OH1. And so that's one of the things that if I saw this, if I saw a coach doing this, I would say, hey, by the way, you can move your setter over here, and they can,
that's
they'll have a couple steps left. And the other thing that I work really hard on with this one is to talk to the middle and say, hey, listen, you got to go, immediately diagonally to your approach point. and get ready because the OH2 is going to be hitting outside, and they usually get this. But those are the kind of things you want to do once you get the pass up out of this particular rotation.
Sure. Yeah. 4 off and 3 on for that middle one is the way we would say it. 4 steps off and 3 back to her spot. So she
Oh,
has to
that's
make
good.
that.
Yeah, yeah. I don't use that, but I will now.
Yeah. Yeah. 4 off and 3 on. For the outsides, 5 off and 4 on. But yeah, the setter just needs to clear as fast as possible, and it looks weird when you put your setter here, which I didn't do for this shot, but
Yeah,
she can
yeah,
definitely sit right in this area. We'd have the back row intact, we'd have the front row intact, and we would have all the relationships between these players stable.
yeah.
So another in rotation 3, another easy possibility is to get that libero into a position where she can have more of the court. You can easily just take the setter up, move the outside hitter to the left, and pull the opposite back. This works when you have an opposite that can pass. And again, a lot of times that's a luxury. I think a lot of coaches now are looking for an opposite that can hit on the right side and can pass. If you have that, you have a lot of flexibility in what you can do in serve receive. Oh, we already did this. Oh, no, it's not alternate one, but here's another possibility we've talked about. If the outside hitter two is the great passer on the team, she can simply back up and she can still pretty easily transition after pass to get outside and attack. So I like this a lot when you have an outside hitter too. That's a good passer. And obviously you can do the same with the opposite hitter. That's just another option in this the same idea. The opposite can pass and then transition to the outside.
All right. So here's a question from Coach
Yeah.
Neal. What tactics do you use as a coach to suggest switching from alternative one to another, rather than individually telling each athlete where to go? Great question. Oh,
Well,
at least, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. I mean, I think certainly as a coach, you need to know your team. You need to know your team. Beyond that, you need to know your opponent. You need to know your league. So if you know your team, if you know who the best passer is, and if you know, then the team most likely knows as well. Then it's a simple question. Where should we put the player that we want passing the ball? Are we going to put her in the middle, the left, or the right? Generally, you would put the best passer in the middle of the court so that they can take the most. If you have an opponent that is only serving zone one, which I certainly have done, and some of my superiors at various teams have done, then maybe you want to put your best passer into area one. So it is a great question. How do you decide? You decide based on who can handle it. It can get really in depth with what passers are good in what zones of the court, what passers are good when the ball is on the left side of their body or the right side or short or over their head. Generally, I think most coaches have an idea or at least have guessed who their best passer is, and you want to put that best passer where the ball is going to go on that serve.
I think the other thing to think about is what level of complication can your team handle at a
Yeah,
particular point. So if they're, I would err on the side of simplicity and until they know it better than you know it. They're like, oh, I see. Yep, here's what we need to do. So part of that is practicing it And to be honest, I don't practice it enough to be, I go with kind of standard stuff most of the time. And that's probably a flaw because, somebody's going to have a bad day and you can sub them out. But if you've got four decent passers in the entire club in terms of really good numbers on serve receive, you don't have a lot of options other than moving people around. So getting them to understand what they can do and why they're doing it is something that if they can get it, fine. But if all of a sudden you've changed, on the fly, or maybe after one practice, you change a serve receive in a match, and it causes confusion, the hesitation you're going to have is probably not going to make up for the better passers' capability because they'll have a confusion about a gap and or a seam, and when they have a confusion about a seam, bad things happen. Which it goes all the way back to Coach Jim Keen telling us that hey, your three receiving players and really all of the players should have a discussion about who does what, not when the ball is served and calling ball or calling mine, but rather before the serve, especially on serve receive. So
Right.
we don't, I've discouraged in my last year or two after our conversations with Jim. I've said we got to have a conversation beforehand. I don't need mine on a serve receive. Yeah, on a transition ball, yeah, we want to know if you've seen it and you're going to the back corner and you're the left back defender, but you saw it early and you're going there. You can call off the middle back defender and say mine and just say, okay, great. Now make that person an option for an attack. But on serve receive, confusion is a killer.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think as you as you get into this, probably the most important thing about serve receive is I think we're a little quick as coaches to want to make a switch mid mid reception. Say the other team gets 2 or 3 or 4 points in a row, we feel like we have to do something. Um, Really, you ought to be putting yourself in your best position to receive. And I tend to trust my best serve receive position. It's almost an act of desperation to have an alternate. Yet, I would suggest to coaches um, that you have a serve receive. This is what we're doing in this rotation. And then you also have an alternate that you can go to that's maybe a close second, hopefully is a close second to your best. But I think it's generally better to put your best out there, but then have that alternate ready and have practiced it. You've got to practice it in practice. Otherwise, they're going to be confused. You're going to get called for that overlap. Um, so things get easier once we get to row four. Now, I just want to take a quick step back. If you're playing a 6-2, we've already covered the other three rotations of a 6-2. It's the same. It's the same three that we went through. We just went through rotations 1, 2, and 3. In a 6-2, rotations 4, 5, and 6 would be similar. You have all the same options. And certainly there are variations of those. Maybe your setters are your left side hitters, or they're your right side hitters, or maybe even your middles. So there are lots of possibilities, but the standard uh, for a 6-2 has already been demonstrated in those first three rotations.
Yeah, and
So
for those who are new to even that concept is we when a 6-2 we're using two setters, and in this diagram here, the opposite would either be another setter or would be a setter would be subbed in for them. And so they would, if once you have a setter where the opposite is in this diagram in the back row right, they're going to go through all the same things we just covered in the first three rotations.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So things get easier and harder when the setter is in the front row. They're easier because we can move the setter around a little bit. We can move the hitters around a little bit. They're harder because now we only have um, two front row attackers. If you're USA Volleyball men's team, that doesn't matter. They're still going to use the outside hitter one to hit a back row quick, and they're still going to use that opposite to hit on the right side behind the attack line. But if you're a high school team, now things get a little trickier for attacking from the front row. The common setup in rotation four is to do this thing in the Midwest anyway, we would call it a stack, where we're going to take the outside hitter two and move her all the way over to the left hand side of the court, whether it's just standing out of the way or if she's, that's not what I wanted to show.
Yeah, I know where you're going with this. So
Or the outside hitter two could come back and pass.
right, right.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Yep.
Steve.
Yeah. So on this diagram, the opposite would be pulled all the way back. At least I would pull them back to the back right corner. You'd move the bro over. You'd move the outside hitter one over, and then you'd bring the OH2 diagonally all the way across, which looks weird, but it's doable and fine. And that
Yeah.
would get them into the hitting position. Would look a lot like you had it set up in row three in a lot of ways. So
Yeah. That outside hitter can go anywhere in the back row. They can take the place of the opposite. They can take the place of the libero.
right.
Um, they could go in between the libero and move the opposite hitter. It's really an easy rotation to work with because that back row can go anywhere. They can slide left and right so long as they maintain their relationship. And that outside hitter, too, really only has to worry about the opposite staying in front of the opposite. And then, of course, the setter and the middle one have to kind of hide in the front left in that situation.
Yep.
Rotation five, maybe even the easiest of all the rotations to deal with. Um, Setter is right in the front middle of the court, so most of the time what happens is that outside hitter one is a great player. She comes back and becomes a passer. We will tuck that outside hitter two. You can tuck the opposite back and put the outside hitter two in. Um, it all depends here on who is your best passer, and this rotation five should be one of the easiest rotations to side out. You have your two best hitters in the front row, or at least your best middle and your best outside hitter. Sure, there are only two attackers, but you should be able to get into your, in one way or another, get your best passer into the best place to receive.
And it's also fairly common for teams to start in rotation five when they're running a 5-1.
Yeah, that's something that we haven't talked much about. Rotation five is a starting place because, in theory, your outside hitter one is the best hitter on the floor. So, if you're going to start this way, um, most teams that do it have a setter that can block somewhat.
Yes, it would be helpful.
if you're a if you're a high school team that's playing a 5-1 with a 5'2" setter, maybe this isn't the right option for you. Maybe you want to start with that setter in the back row. But if you've got my last high school team that I coached, I think our setter was about 5'9", and our outside hitter one was our best hitter. So it was really easy to start in row five for us.
Yeah.
So row six, also pretty straightforward, very simple to deal with because we have that outside hitter one in a place where we can move her around a little bit. A
The big
common.
thing in all these
Okay.
back and all these when setters front row is just getting clear on where your opposite should be. So, especially with younger players, the opposite can wander around in the back and not stay in rotation. So, just be aware of that and teach them, hey, you still need to be between the two lateral, you need to use BJs. You need to pay attention to your fences because sometimes they'll just wander a little bit and get on the wrong side of one of the other players in the back row.
Yeah, I think that's where that pointing issue comes in. I use that more and more
Yeah.
um, for drills where we're rotating in the very few actual drills that I run. Um, where we'll point to where we're rotating to. We have players point to where they're going to rotate to in the game when they're younger and they're learning. Do I go this way or that way? I mean, it's like the little kids little league baseball where you hit the ball and the kid runs to third. It would have helped if the kid would have stood in the batter's box in practice and pointed to first base and said, "Okay, after I hit, I'm going there." you know
Yeah.
so it's a valuable tool. It helps orient the players, and you just have to take a little bit of time. I know it's hard to take time as coaches to do this kind of thing, but man, you got to practice, yeah, that
Here's
going
another
through
thing
things.
now
Yeah.
that I'm thinking about it. I spend a lot of time early on. We finish a point. My first thing to them is go to your rotated positions and
Hmm.
then rotate. Because what'll happen is your experienced players will go to their next spot because they'll know they've been doing this all along. But your inexperienced players won't, and they don't see it. So to allow them to see it, I tell them go to your rotated positions now. Rotate now. Get into whatever serve receive or serving configuration you want to get to, which we didn't cover in this. We were covering mostly receive situations here because we could spend
Right.
hours doing this. Um, the other thing to point out here is we've gone on the assumption that you're going to use a three-person serve receive, and at some levels you may want to use four, and you just have to use the same tools and concepts that we've discussed here and add that fourth person in however you want to do that. um, and that's a call you have to make as a coach.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just want to point out that the U.S. men's team, who flies around at the top of the world as far as the rankings and best teams on the planet, um, they use at times a four-person serve receive. So as coaches, every one of these rotations, you can find how do I get that extra person into the serve receive. It's very simple to do, as you've seen. I'm just going to back up a couple.
While you're doing that, and so why would you not want to use four? Why would you not want to use five? um, there's a trade-off um, in terms of negotiating every one of the seams between players as one piece. And each seam can introduce confusion or hesitation, and hesitation on serve receive is deadly. And that's why Jim Keen's point about decide beforehand who's got what seam and who's going to cover deep, and
Yeah.
all of those things. If you have those decided beforehand, you have gained at least 2/10 of a second on a serve because it's already decided. If you wait to say, hear somebody say mine, okay, server hits the ball. Somebody calls mine. It's going to take them 2/10 of a second human reaction time to call it. It's going to cost you probably another 2/10 of a second to react to it. And by the
Yeah.
way, the typical serve, even at high school level, is over and to the floor within 1.2 seconds probably, and that's fairly slow. And 8/10 of a second for a good server. So you're not going to be able to cover as much ground and get set nearly as well if there's that level of confusion. So buy yourself some time.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I went back to rotation five, the common rotation five. We've tucked the outside hitter two here into the back corner, but you can see how easy it would be to move the libero over a little bit, move the opposite hitter over a little bit, and then you could take this outside hitter and put them anywhere along here, uh, maybe even just in a support role. Maybe say a team is serving the opposite short. You take that outside hitter too, and you could put her up here instead. She doesn't she doesn't need to be all the way back here. She only has to be worried about her front to back rotation or front to back overlap with the M1. So this outside hitter too could easily stand right here and just take that short ball with her hands, or she could, any one of these back row players could be left out easily in rotation 5. So you just have to be a little bit creative about how to add that fourth player. But it does become pretty easy to add them if you need to. So have we started rotation 6? I don't think we did.
Yeah, let's run that.
Yeah, okay. So rotation 6, also very simple. The simplest thing in rotation 6 is just to leave the back row, the three back row players as they are. You can move the outside hitter 1 over to the M2 if you want. That way, the outside hitter is ready to go and hit out of zone 4. They can, you know, easily come back like this, and you can move the outside hitter 2 or the opposite or the libero out, or you can let all 4 of them pass. The thing that we have to be careful of here, the outside hitter 1 came from this area. So the fence is with outside hitter 2. So outside hitter 1 needs to be in front of outside hitter 2. So that's
Yeah.
the place to be
And
careful.
if you were doing the outside hitters and libero only passing, which a lot of coaches do, I certainly do a fair amount of that, and you drop that opposite all the way back, the OH2 needs to be careful and look over at the OH1 and vice versa to make
Yeah.
sure that there's 1 foot of that OH2, 1 toe of that OH2 is in front of the 2 feet of the OH2. And, that's easy to do, but if you have a really aggressive OH2 who likes to cheat up in the middle, yeah, you could get called out and it, be inadvertent, but not intentional, but it can happen. So it's one of those little things you watch for.
Yeah, for sure. And pre-serve routines, some people dance around a little bit. I'm not a fan, but it
Yeah.
happens. And if you get a little adrenaline rush at championship point and somebody, steps forward or something, you just have to be aware of that
Yeah.
situation. There, in my mind, there's no reason to be close. We can be 1 foot on the court. If somebody is a foot farther ahead than the other one, that really shouldn't make that much of a difference.
Yeah.
I would not test the referees by being close.
Yeah. That's, you're not buying anything there.
Right, right. Another weird one. I'll just throw this out just to be creative. This is rotation 6, and I didn't show the movement, but outside hitter 1 is coming from the front middle. You could pull that outside hitter 1 all the way over to the right. What problem does that cause you? You have no outside hitter on the left. So, on the team that I was just with this year, our middle 2 was a converted outside hitter. So in this case, we would have our middle 2 hit on the left and our outside hitter pass and then hit on the right.
Yeah.
So
And you'd have
it's
your OH2 run the pipe, maybe.
yeah, yeah. It's just something, just to show a little bit of creativity. This is something that you can do. And again, I would encourage coaches to, even for your own learning, you you stand on the court with 6 players. Everybody points at the players that they have to be careful of, and then move somebody around and move them to places that may be advantageous to you, and see, uh, can they react? Think about it for yourself. It's okay to have questions in front of your own team. It's okay to stand there and say, "Man, is this legal? Can I do it this way?" Um, and my last point, I guess, I know this is somewhat sloppy looking, but that's intentional. What a lot of coaches do is on the left hand side of this chart, I have written the rotation of my players. So player number 3, I've circled because it's the setter. Um, in all the examples we just gave, player number 1 would be the opposite. So this is their lineup for rotation 1. This is the lineup for rotation 2 and for rotation 3. I see almost every coach that draws things out on paper anyway will draw their serve receive setup. So in this case, here's rotation 1, and they've chosen to move the setter up that the outside hitter 1 is not going to pass, and the opposite is going to pass, and they're going to hit on the left. And then moving to rotation 2, here's where they're supposed to be on the court, and then you draw out where are they actually going to stand during serve receive. And I think that's really helpful. And most of us, I only drew 2 or I only drew 1 option. Most of us draw out to the right the second option or maybe even a third option in case there was trouble.
Yeah, and again, I think this you use these depending on your um, on what you really want to try to accomplish and what the capability or knowledgeability of your players are. And one of the things I've been doing increasingly is to try to get my players to do the problem solving to the point where I make it very clear at the beginning of the season there are going to be times when you're going to look over at the bench and go, no coach, that's wrong. Something I say from the bench, they'll go, no, 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 we're fine here, and they'll be right most of the time. And when that
Yep.
happens, yeah, you can take it as a, oh, gee, I should have had that. But the fact that your kids do it and are more because they're in the middle of it means you've probably done a good job of getting the points across to them, and they're using them well.
Yeah, I agree. And something that there's a couple of different things you can use here. One, you need to empower your captain to know the choices. You need to empower the players to be able to tell the captain, "Hey, we've got a problem here." So if you're uh, if you're the new outside hitter 2 that got subbed in, you have to know who the captain is. You need to know that before the whistle blows, man, we're lost. Hey, captain, we're in trouble. I don't know where to go. And then the captain needs to know her choices, which are 1, can we ask for a lineup check? 2, is it so bad that we need to call a timeout because the captain is empowered to call a timeout? And oof, that was tricky for me. David Cordes, another former guest, uh, it helped me get over that hurdle of allowing the captain to call a timeout. And once I thought about it, it made a lot of sense. I don't put a lot of value on timeouts anyway. I think they're nearly uh, I don't want to say useless, but they're not nearly as helpful as what we as coaches believe they are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to allow a player to be able to call a timeout when the player knows that the team is in trouble, I think would be a great thing to do.
I'll
So
tell
that
you, yeah.
yeah,
In practice, late, I'll introduce either. I was doing a cross court pepper 4-to-4 kind of drill this week, first time, just showing them and having them do it. And I just think back to coaching even 10 years ago, not, but 20 years ago, whatever. And, I just keep telling in my head, I go, just leave them alone now. Just go sit down and let them figure it out. And that's it works great because they have to figure it out. So what I find when the newer players, because I have a mix, and I'm doing open gyms now, getting ready for the season, so I don't do a lot of coaching anyway. Um, but I just tell the players, the experienced player, hey, help him out. Joe doesn't know where to go. Just work with him. You teach him. Show him, keep him in rotation, walk him through, try to explain things to him a little bit. And there's a lot more learning that goes on that way. Plus, it's group problem solving. And, I want my team to be a good group problem solving team that can get through challenges, make little adjustments on their own without me having to direct things.
Yeah, agreed. Just, even that simple example that I was giving about the player knowing that they're in trouble, it's so easy. Maybe not to college, but you can do it there too. But in middle school or high school, it is so easy to just ask for a lineup change. But the
Yeah.
player who's not the captain needs to know that it's okay to go to captain and say, "Hey, we're mixed up here." And then the captain needs to choose, okay, are we going to the coach? Are we going to lineup chain or lineup check, or are we calling a timeout? So it's important to, again, it's important to practice that stuff in practice so that they know how to do those things.
Yeah, and there's one other thing that coaches, it just occurred to me that beginning coaches can think about, and even experienced coaches. A lot of times, because let's say one of the things you value is your serve, and you're going to try to put rotations in where your first three servers are your best servers, or your better servers, let's say. Um, as you're trying to do that, you may decide that, let's say you're running a 6-2, and you start in rotation one when you want to serve, and 1, 2, and 3 are fine. But you rotate back to rotation 6 for when you're receiving, when you have to receive. Working that out, I see a lot of coaches, and by the way, this is a strategy. If you're a little bit confused, put your lineup in just like you did and sub out, and sub in your setter. Because I see that a lot, and it's not a bad solution if you're in high school and you got 18 subs. If you're in club and you've got 12, it's probably a waste of a sub. So one of the, especially with the 6-2, because you've got at least two subs per rotation if you're subbing in for your front row player. So one of the things to think about there is to practice rotation 6 receive, who's in the lineup, and get your players to understand it, because they'll get confused and they need to practice that. And we find at the beginning of the season that's where we get tripped up a little bit, and then by third or fourth match, usually teams have figured it out. But it's a small point, but it happens a lot at the younger levels, or let's say less experienced levels, because you may be. I'm still at a school where we had some things this week we did to promote the sport, and seniors come up who've never played before come up and go, I think we'd play this year. I'm like, okay. Happy to have you. Let's see how you can do. And up till this year, I'd take anybody who wanted to play, and I probably still will. But seniors are a little tougher because varsity spots are a little tougher to come by. But in the beginning days, hey, when you got 13 guys, a 14th guy is great to have. But that's by that same token, getting them to understand, when we rotate back one to receive, that how that's going to work. That's a good thing to do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Anything you're going to do, and anything you do in the match, you're going to want to do in practice. I think
Yeah,
that's
that's
the
it.
short way of saying that.
Yeah,
Um, and people pick this game up in their 30s and 40s at times, so it's not about an age.
yeah,
I watched a couple of years ago at nationals. I watched the 12 and under national championship match, and they had a girl who was about 4'6", who was a dynamite outside hitter, and she was just pounding the ball. She knew exactly where to go and where all her teammates were supposed to be. So at 12, she had it down, and somebody that's new in their 30s, might not quite understand all these crazy rules that we have for the sport. So it's not age related. It's about
no, not at
experience, and
all.
about
Well, think about our guest last week. Morgan did a pretty good job of in the first round of the NCAA's in terms of her picks. I
yeah,
think she missed two.
yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's
No,
not an age thing at all.
age is not a factor. Well, so that's rotation. The simple ones. Maybe we'll go into some more different systems or more complicated things. That's at some point, but that's your basic 5-1 sort of standard rotations and serve receive options.
Yeah, and feel free to ask questions in the comments. Certainly, I don't usually ask for it, but hey, subscribe if you want to subscribe, or at least hit the like button. That helps us get a little more exposure. And yes, Neil asked or said the audio is cleared. I think I found the problem on my end. So,
Yeah,
yeah, so I think.
you must have because I didn't do anything.
Yeah, when you were serving us two feeds, I thought it might be a bandwidth problem, but I think it was an interference problem with one of the things I've got set up here. So,
Okay.
thanks for joining us today. We'll have more topics like this where we're just having discussion about things, and we like to bring guests in when we can, but that won't always be the case. And we thought rotations was one that would be a good topic for just a discussion. All right. We'll see you next time. BJ, have a good rest of your Sunday, and we'll move on. And Monica says thank you, and always appreciate it when we get that. So hope you enjoyed it.